United States has always been an elitist democracy, an elitist version of democracy. As a consequence, the representative figure of democracy has been the affluent white male.
Mm-hmm.
Consequently, the measure of equality has been race and class and gender. To be equal is to be equal to not any white man, but the figure of the affluent white man. The abstract figure. The abstract figure that is supposed to stand in for all of us. But we know that this hasn't worked. Because we're still struggling for freedom. Freedom is a constant struggle. But we should not neglect the regulative role that the figure of the white woman, as putatively abstract, the regulative role it has played as a stand-in for the category woman. And of course, as many scholars and activists have pointed out, existing social hierarchies even determine who gets to be a legitimate victim or a legitimate survivor, a legitimate survivor of gender violence, who gets to represent those who constitute legitimate victims. Beth Ritchie has written about the every woman who peoples our imaginations, particularly with respect to the possible eruption of gender violence. And if you're familiar with the early era of the struggle against violence against women, the slogan was, every woman can be a victim. Every woman is potentially a victim of violence.
Mm-hmm.
But as she pointed out, this every woman figure was also race and class. And so we can ask, why is it so difficult to posit black women, women of color, as the exemplary figures? And so we ask questions about the connections we make. We can say that the experiences of women of color are rich and generative, but they are only considered to be experiences that can relate to other women of color.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps if it had not been assumed that we had to work with the most general of categories, and perhaps if racist hierarchies were not already internalized within that presumption of generality, we might have recognized the value of holding on to the specific and the particular. It seems to me that this is the lesson that the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to impart. A century and a half after this insight should have animated our history. And what they are saying is that if Black lives matter, then all lives would matter. The Native Hawaiian women's lives mattered, then all lives would matter. I just referred to a text that the students in our seminar read last week. I see some of you here. You recognize the text. Yesterday we were discussing the courses on American punishment from the penitentiary to the prison industrial complex? I have to get the exact title right, Robert. American Punishment from the Penitentiary to the Prison Industrial Complex. So yesterday, we were talking about the way in which the development of women's prisons teaches us something very different about the way the punishment system functions. Even though women constitute a relatively small minority of people in prison all over the world, the insight we garner by looking at women's prisons far surpasses the quantity, the smallness of the quantity. And so I think I was, we were talking about women of color, trans women of color in prison, and the insights about the entire apparatus that are acquired as a result of focusing on what appears to be a relatively small population. And we were pointing out that when women's prisons were introduced in the U.S., and this was in the 1870s, in 1873, the first women's prison opened in Indiana, that these places for women were reformatories. There were places where women criminals could be rehabilitated. But now, of course, the penitentiary was supposed to be a space of rehabilitation and reform. But for the men, it was, I would have to say white men, not native men, not black men. But the ideological premise was that these places would allow men to reflect on their actions and to reform themselves and become better citizens. As a matter of fact, the institution of the prison is a quintessentially democratic institution. It is an institution that is only conceivable under conditions of democracy where rights and liberties are recognized in the larger population. Because the role of the prison is to divest people of those rights. And you cannot be divested of something that you have not already acquired. And democracy is required. Well, anyway.
Nice try.
But the point is that women were not considered to be citizens. So women's prisons emerged as a result of feminist activism as places where women criminals could be rehabilitated into better wives and mothers. Because this was the era of the cult of true womanhood. However, what is interesting is that those women who went to prison did not tend to be from the middle classes. They did not tend to be bourgeois women who would have the opportunity to be full-time wives and mothers. They were poor women. They were working women. And so what this meant was that the women's prisons reformed women criminals by transforming them into domestic servants. Because as they learned how to be better wives and mothers, they were actually learning the skills of domestic work. So until the 1980s and the booming prison economy associated with deindustrialization and the dismantling of the welfare state, see Bill Clinton. Until that period, women's prison architecture even reflected this domestic approach. Now, we know that the over-incarceration practices in the U.S. have led to the imprisonment of more people than anywhere else in the world, more in absolute numbers and more per capita. The United States has 25% of the entire planet's incarcerated population.
We're number one.
But only 5% of the population at large. Now, when one looks at women, it's interesting that the more than 200,000 women in U.S. prisons, and in the 1970s, there were approximately 200,000 people in prison. So Robert was talking about the tenfold increase from the 70s to the present. But the 200,000 women in prison today constitute 1/3 of the entire documented female prison population in the world.
Wow.
The countries that have the next highest women's prison population are China. China has 84,600 women in prison, and Russia with 59,000. And of course, we could continue to talk about what this mass incarceration means, this over-incarceration in the context of a prison industrial complex. And we would also have to talk about Hawaii. And we would have to talk about the fact that private prison companies have offered possibilities for incarcerating people arrested here in Hawaii, in small towns and, well, a small town in the state of Arizona.
Right.
So isn't it bizarre that there are 2 prisons in this small town in Arizona called Eloy that hold primarily Hawaiian prisoners? Well, I understand there's also a controversy now surrounding the building of a new jail in Oahu. And that there is and that CCA, Corrections Corporation of America, which runs the 2 prisons in Eloy, Arizona, is trying to convince the government here to invest in a new private jail. But I also understand that there are people who are introducing new strategies, a new vocabulary. We're talking about decarceration as opposed to incarceration. And I would say that I hope the latter wins out.
Yeah.
That it is important, methodologically, whether one is conducting research or whether one is involved in activism, to produce a broad framework that consists of an acknowledgement of a range of connections. And it is within that broad framework that one can begin to explore or act against specific, act around specific kinds of issues. And I was talking about gender violence before. If one separates domestic violence or intimate violence, or sexual violence from state violence, then from the very outset, one is ruling out the possibility that there might be some kind of connection, some kind of symbiosis that leads state violence, that links state violence and individualized violence, that links the violence that is so embedded in the prison apparatus and the violence that happens within intimate relationships. Which leads me to say a few words about feminism. You know, I know that there are some feminists who can't understand why the younger generation does not accept the feminism of their grandmothers. And I'm not going to mention any names. Maybe afterwards. But I think we're witnessing the emergence of a much more complex, complicated, productive feminism that is being embraced by many people, regardless of their gender identification, regardless of their regardless of the way in which they identify into certain racialized communities. And I would like to think that this new feminism is related to what you might call abolition feminism. I have written about abolition democracy, which I have discussed in connection with the W.E.B. Du Bois's notion that democracy, as we know it in this country today, is lacking what would have occurred had, in the aftermath of slavery, or during the struggle against slavery, abolition democracy been acknowledged as a more substantive democracy, as a democracy that would have been made anew, not the democracy of the American Revolution that was built on colonization and slavery, but it would be a new democracy, new institutions that would have allowed for the incorporation of former slaves, and a democracy that would have acknowledged the sovereignty of indigenous people. But that democracy didn't happen.
No.
That was the abolition democracy. And so today, I think we might begin to speak about abolition feminism. Abolition feminism as opposed to what you might call carceral feminism. A feminism that relied on punitive solutions, that relied on the state. But this is not so much about making violence against women figure into a preordained abolitionist framework. It's about demonstrating that punitive solutions, which are rarely solutions, rarely, even the punitive behavior of parents toward the child. They're rarely solutions. And these punitive solutions cannot help us imagine a world without violence, a world beyond violence. And abolition encourages us to think beyond retribution, beyond vengeance, beyond the carceral, toward ways of perhaps ultimately depositing gender violence into the dustbin of history. And I think this should be an important democratic ideal. How do we rid our world of the gender violence that has wrought such havoc within our families and our communities? of ideologies of Islamophobia have had a detrimental impact on more productive forms of anti-racism, but also on our ability to fight back against gender violence. During the last years, there has been an intensification of overt anti-immigrant racism, unabashed Islamophobia, violent anti-Muslim racism associated with the so-called war on terror, and even the president himself, even as his military policies have served to accelerate material and ideological assaults against Muslims. Even he was subject to, and continues to be subject to, Islamophobic speculations about his birth and religious affiliation. And I think he was But during the same period, we've witnessed the impact of the Patriot Act, the justification of terror, and the proliferation of prisons in service of the so-called war on terror. The most profitable sector of the prison industrial complex is now immigrant detention. And at the same time, we've seen the intensification of attacks by the Israeli government on the West Bank and Gaza. It is not accidental, it seems to me, that young people began to speak out against white supremacy and racism precisely as Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism were becoming increasingly apparent. The use of the war on terror, and this, I'm reading an op-ed that I wrote not long ago for The Guardian, I believe. The use of the war on terror as a broad designation of the project of 21st century Western democracy has served as a justification of anti-Muslim racism. It has further legitimized the Israeli occupation of Palestine. It has redefined the repression of immigrants and indirectly led to the militarization of local police departments throughout the country. Police departments, including on college and university campuses, have acquired military surplus from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan through the Department of Defense excess property program. Thus, in response to the police killing of Michael Brown, demonstrators challenging racist police violence were confronted by police officers dressed in camouflage uniforms, armed with military weapons and driving armored vehicles. Thus, it is impossible, it seems to me, to understand racism of the first decades of the 21st century without recognizing its articulation with the torture and the military assaults and the ideological dimension of the so-called war on terror. Although we tend to imagine Islamophobia in the form of state and perhaps extra-legal violence and state terror against men who practice Islam, or men who appear to be Muslims, as they are representationally produced to be terrorists. And not only in European countries like France and Belgium, but also in the US by such figures as, such people as some of the current political candidates. But it is Muslim women, and especially those who wear the hijab, who become the most visible targets of a range of violences. In France, the hijab has been declared illegal in public schools under the principle of secularity, or what they call in France, laïcité. And this is putatively for the purpose of emphasizing the separation of church and state and achieving the assimilation of minorities. minorities. But we can talk about the suburbs of Paris, the banlieue, and we can talk about the state of education and the state of employment, and that certainly doesn't appear to point to assimilation. In the United States, there's the case of the Palestinian-American activist Razmia Odeh, which reveals the way state violence produces and reproduces gender violence. And I'm not sure whether you're familiar with the case of Razmia Odeh in Chicago. She is a 68-year-old American of Palestinian origins who was recently arrested because she had apparently answered questions regarding her history with respect to arrests inaccurately. You always get asked, have you ever been convicted? That's the box that we're trying to get rid of anyway, for universities, for jobs, and also for citizenship. She eventually received her citizenship. But as a result of the fact that she was an activist in her community, and particularly in relation to the boycott, sanctions, and divestment campaign, she was arrested and charged with answering incorrectly on a naturalization application, and therefore she was threatened with having her citizenship taken from her and threatened with deportation, not to her original home, but to Jordan. And I mention this because she did not answer the question because of the horrendous sexual torture she had experienced when she was arrested. And she was subject to physical torture, sexual torture, and some of it was perpetrated in front of her father, who is now deceased. So there was a major campaign around in Chicago and other parts of the U.S. To save her life and to prevent her deportation. And I'll say this afternoon, I had the opportunity to meet two really exciting and enthusiastic students from Birzeit University who are participating in a tour, the Right to Education, R2E tour. And some of you were present, I think. It was an amazing event, wasn't it?
Yep.
And you can follow them online. This tour is also organized by Black for Palestine, the efforts to bring Black communities and Palestinian communities in struggle together. Now let me conclude. I know I've been speaking too long.
No.
But let me say that this is a particular historical conjunction. And at moments such as this moment, we embrace new possibilities we were once afraid to acknowledge. But at the same time, there's signs that we could move in a backwards direction. On the one hand, there appears to be a new consensus against mass incarceration. People everywhere are talking about the prison issue. People here in Hawaii are aware, am I right? Mm-hmm. There's this new collective consciousness. And let me say that 20 years ago, nobody wanted to talk about, well, there was some. and probably a lot of you. But most people did. But on the one hand, there appears to be this new consensus against mass incarceration and against police brutality, police violence, and young people, especially young people of color, especially young black people and young black women, and especially young black queer women, are taking the lead in struggles against racist state violence. And now there's an emphasis on connections, on intersectionality, which largely comes from feminist influences on current struggles. I've been speaking about feminism, but I want to be clear that the feminism I'm speaking about is not the feminism that Hillary Clinton. Anti-capitalist.
Yeah.
These connections between anti-capitalism, anti-racism, anti-colonialism, and the struggle against gender violence and And what's so exciting about all of these new movements is that they recognize the importance of this anti-capitalist, anti-colonialist, anti-racist feminism. And they take seriously the importance of developing an analysis of capitalism and recognizing the connections with the attack on labor. And they see racism within an intersectional framework. Anti-black racism requires an understanding of anti-indigenous racism, anti-Latino